when I signed up for this, I didn't realize that I was going to be following Terry, which in terms of tough acts to follow for this series, is probably at the top of my list, but I still think it's going to be fun. It's good to be here. I've certainly attended many talks here in the past. As Michael mentioned, I did a master's in HCI, let's just say a few years ago, and I worked on Terry's project on collaborative workspaces. It was called actually interactive workspaces. We had a room in the basement here. And also was influenced quite a bit by Professor Pam Hines, who's still here in the MS&E department, who studies distributed work in teams, especially globally distributed teams. And you'll see bits of both of that in today's talk. So that's enough about me. That was a good introduction. I want to tell you about a guy named Dallas. Dallas is an electrical engineer. He was working a few years ago at Willow Garage as an electrical engineer, and he faced a dilemma. His family was in Indiana, but his job was in California. And until recently, the only solution was to choose one or the other or waste a lot of time and money flying back and forth. So Dallas chose his family. He lives in Indiana, and he continued to work for Willow using sort of the traditional teleconferencing options that are available today: video chat, remote collaboration tools. But he felt like over time, his sense of presence was starting to attenuate. He felt like his connection to his colleagues was weakening. He missed informal gatherings. He felt like he was out of the loop on some things. I know people would forget to ask him questions. They would forget to keep him in the loop. So yeah, so in short, he was losing his sense of presence. And luckily, he was working at a place that had a lot of things he could put together a solution. And with one of his coworkers there, a guy named Kurt Myers, he put together a prototype for remote presence, which was called TechSci. TechSci seemed pretty cool. A lot more people got involved at the project at that point, including myself, and we went through many rounds of prototyping and user study. I'm going to skip over most of that, but we took everything we learned there and we applied it to Beam. Actually, I'll come back to it later in the talk as I go through our research. So, Beam launched last fall from our company, Suitable Technologies. We believe it's the best remote presence device that you can buy. And for Dallas, what this does is this technology gives back his sense of presence. Now he can hang out at his desk so people can drop by and ask him questions whenever they want to. He can follow people out of a meeting, continuing the discussion. He can find people to talk in person, sometimes when they don't want to be found. And he can see things from all angles. He's not just stuck on a wall. He's not stuck on a desk. He can move around. He can see things from all angles as if he were there in person. And he has a great quote. He says, "Living in Indiana and working in Silicon Valley with Beam isn't the best of both worlds. It is both worlds." And this is really how he sees it. So what I'd like to do today is review some research on remote presence, even if it wasn't called that yet when the research was being done. Talk about why we designed Beam the way we did, the research that we've done since we've built Beam, and then where we see the research going in the future and some of the open questions that we think are really interesting right now. So I think to really give you a quick overview of the Beam product, I would show our product video. I didn't want to include the sound, so I didn't bother to hook it up. But I just want, for people who haven't seen this, if you've ever been to our website, you've probably seen this video already. So one quick note on terminology. We refer to the person operating the device as a pilot. So in this video, this woman, Susan, is the pilot, and everyone else is a local. The people who are interacting with her through the device, we refer to them as locals. So Beam really consists of three pieces: the remote presence device itself, this dock, which is for charging, and then the software that the pilot installs on their computer in order to control and use the system. And you'll see examples of all of this through the video. Some other stats: it has a 17-inch LCD display. It's 5 feet 2 inches tall, or 158 centimeters. Has 2 HD cameras. You can see how they're stacked to give you a view both in front and below. Microphone array above the screen, speaker below, 2 Wi-Fi radios, and top speed of 1.5 meters per second, or about a little over 3 miles per hour. And so this is the punchline at the end of this video, is that it turns out she was home the whole time, traveling around the world, working with her team in Asia, America, and everything, but she was actually comfortably at home in her own office. So yeah, if you want to see that video again, it's at suitabletech.com. The benefits of working remotely, also sometimes called teleworking or telecommuting, are pretty well documented, I think, at this point. There was some research came out of Stanford, actually, in the economics department last year. Nicholas Bloom did the largest, most empirical study yet on this topic with a Chinese travel agency called C-Trip, where they did an experimental where they grouped the workers into people who were able to work at home and those who had to come into the office, and found, outside the margin of error, that people were not only more productive and happier, but also healthier when they were able to work at home. And that was, and that was in terms of reduced number of sick days. So it's like a win-win-win, and it means you can live anywhere, you can cut down on travel and other costs. So why doesn't everyone work from home if it's so great? Well, there are several reasons. Some of the most commonly cited are things like some tasks are difficult to do this way. To be honest, sometimes you need to be able to use your thumbs or other things that are hard to do remotely with technology available today. Sometimes there's a stigma or a suspicion of not working as hard when you're at home. It depends on the company culture. And one of the most commonly cited things is the importance of face-to-face communication. And the reason I have a picture of Yahoo up here, many of you may have heard about. There was some news earlier this year where they basically put a total ban on any kind of remote working inside the company, and that was one of the things that was cited in their internal memo, the importance of face-to-face communication. So that's why remote presence is so exciting to us, and I think it's a really transformative technology, because you can get all of these benefits of being able to work remotely, being happier, being more productive, being able to have more control over your time and where you live, but also still preserve the rich face-to-face interaction that is so important too. People have pondered the possibilities of remote presence for centuries and perhaps longer. So I'm going to do like 400 years of philosophy in 2 minutes. So starting with Descartes, for example, who had this concept of an evil demon with the power to intercept your senses and present arbitrary information to you to basically trick you into thinking there's a world, an alternate world that's not the one that actually exists. This is similar to the brain in a vat thought experiment, famous one in philosophy. They're both basically a man-in-the-middle attack on your brain, saying you don't know if your brain's in a body or if it's in a jar somewhere hooked up to some sensors and some stimuli. But they both raise the question of what it actually means to believe you're anywhere. And in some sense, the reason I'm bringing this up is, in some sense, what we're trying to do with remote presence is attempt to provide enough sensory information to your brain to make you think that you are somewhere else, at least to some degree, maybe for the purposes of the work that you're trying to do. Also, I wanted to mention phenomenologists such as Heidegger encourage us to see the difference between perceiving objects as they actually are and the purpose, and perceiving them as fulfilling a purpose. So in the language of Heidegger, we want remote presence to be a ready-to-hand technology, not present at hand. You don't want to see a remote presence device and just see it as a collection of components and pieces of technology. You want to see what it's for, which is actually transporting you or transporting someone else from one place to another. And finally, I wanted to mention the blind man's cane example from Merleau-Ponty, which suggests that when a blind man finding his way through the world by using a cane, he's not so much feeling the wood of the cane, the wood grain and the specific makeup of how the cane is composed. What he's feeling the world through the cane. And in a very similar way, we want people to experience the world through a remote presence device. So we need to reproduce that as faithfully as we can. Irving Goffman's book from 1959, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, tremendously influential book in computer-mediated communication. And remote presence is definitely no exception. Goffman suggests that all social interaction is a performance. So in every interaction that you have in life, you're trying to present yourself in the way that you want others to perceive you. And this applies, as I said, to all kinds of interactions, but perhaps none more literally than remote presence, because you are literally on camera while you're using it. And so if you're using this kind of technology all day long, a pilot station is kind of like a mini TV studio. Since this is the way people are going to perceive you, you start to care about things like, how's my lighting? What's the acoustic property of the room I'm in? How's my camera positioned? Do I have good microphones? And stuff that you don't normally have to worry about in person, but you're much more conscious of this if you use remote presence. So in the 1980s, researchers started building systems that more closely resemble the kind of remote presence technology that we see today. The Media Spaces project at Xerox PARC, for example, created a connection between the lab in Palo Alto and another one in Portland using real-time audio and video. And these projects really saw the importance of informal communication between team members and saw many similar uses that we've seen with remote presence and with Beam today, such as impromptu conversations, being able to find people. As I mentioned, this was very important for Dallas, creating more informal awareness of each other. And then going forward a few years, there was a paper from Holland and Stornetta called Beyond Being There that I believe was really ahead of its time. And it's interesting because it's a difficult one for people like me as a technology enthusiast to really read and appreciate, because what they say, and what they really prove in the paper, is that remote people will always be at a disadvantage with the kind of technology that we have, no matter how faithfully it reproduces the experience, unless it's good enough that people who are local also have a benefit in using it. So that's why the paper is called Beyond Being There. It's not just being there. It's actually, you need to go beyond that. You need to look for needs that are not being met in physical proximity and focus on those. And I'll come back to this a little bit with our research on Beam. I also wanted to mention the Olsons. Judith and Gary Olson wrote on this theme several years later, showing that new technology hasn't actually improved distance work as much as everyone thinks it has. And they describe something called tightly coupled work, which is work that requires a lot of frequent communication, has a lot of ambiguity, and show that remote technologies don't support most of the features that are so important to this type of work. And there are several things that they list, but some of the most important are shared local context between collaborators, having informal time, having individual control. With the current technology, that really doesn't exist. Nonetheless, in the early part of the last decade, people started to prototype these kinds of systems as the technology started to support it more and more. On the far left, you see something called PROP, or Personal Roving Presence, from John Canny and Eric Paulus at Berkeley. They even tried blimps. That's what the giant eyeball is. And then BiReality was a project at HP Labs from Norm Jupe's lab, which was a highly immersive take on remote presence. This is the pilot room that you see here as kind of a wraparound screen. They really spared no expense, and it was a really interesting system at that time. And of course, we're not the only ones working on this today as well. This team at Microsoft Research, for example, has built something they call the embedded social proxy, which is very similar to a Beam, except that you can't drive it. And it's targeted at the hub and satellite kind of team. Namely, one person is remote from the rest of the people in a local site. And they found some results that are actually really similar to what we've seen with Beam, such as stronger social connections, increased attention and affinity, and increased participation in meetings. And they've published some of this work. You can read some of their findings. So with that as background, before I go any further, I'd like to present our definition of remote presence. It's kind of a new term. It's really not telepresence. It's not robotics. It's something different. Remote presence refers to a system or device that enables people separated by distance to collaborate, communicate, and understand each other as if they shared the same physical space without losing effectiveness over time. And that last part is really, really important. And to put it another way, it's something that you can rely on every day. You can rely on it to do your job.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
What's something that does lose effectiveness over time?
For remote presence, all of these things. So I was just going to give some examples of things that are similar to remote presence. Some people might think of them that way. So for example, audio conferencing is a very valuable tool and enables more collaborative meetings. But you don't have, it's easy to be forgotten when you can't be seen. So if this is the only way that you're interacting with your team, over time, there are going to be meetings where you get something gets brought up and they forget to ask you about it, or they forget that you're on the phone. And sort of that level of frustration, that's what we've seen with our research and some of these other ones. That's why you see the Olsons citing of those factors of tightly coupled work. That frustration builds over time, and it's just not good enough.
So it seems like it's not like the system's becoming less effective over time. It's just that people...
For what you're using it for. Oh, sorry. So the other thing about losing effectiveness over time is, for example, the TechSci system that we built at Willow Garage was functionally very similar to what we've done with Beam, but it only worked 95% of the time versus Beam, 99% plus. And so at the time, we didn't understand the importance of that difference. And it was only once we started putting it into field sites and trying to get people to incorporate that into their normal workday that we discovered that it wasn't good enough. You only have to miss one important meeting for technical reasons before you will stop relying on the technology that caused you to miss that meeting.
So it seems like maybe you're pointing at something that's more about embeddedness or infrastructure, sort of ready-to-handedness that you were talking about then, something about over time. That's...
I guess I think they're related. I'm not sure. I mean, it's just that if you look at all the options that have been prototyped, that have been put out there. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because our system is, if you just do sort of point by point, the components that it has, okay, it has video, has audio, Wi-Fi roaming, whatever. It's actually not that different, but the amount of engineering that has gone to take all those, that heterogeneous system and make the whole thing work together reliably every time has been a tremendous amount of work, and it's really important for this reason. And so, when we put TechSci in the field, we were confused. Why aren't people using this? It does everything that they think it does, but it was just little stuff like, it would roll off the charger once a week or once a month even, or they couldn't connect, for some crazy reason every now and then, and then before long they were all just sitting dark in the corner. Now, I was just going to mention Skype on a laptop is another kind of remote presence that you see more and more. It's mobile, but it requires assistance. That's a big drawback. And then Cisco telepresence is beautiful. It's lifelike quality, but it has a big problem that it's stuck in one place. So here are a couple snapshots of our office incorporating remote presence. So it's pretty much like any other office. We sit around, we talk to each other, we have meetings, but you can sort of substitute beams or people in beams for people being in person. And the interesting thing about it to me, well, there are many interesting things. One interesting thing about it is when I go to the office in the morning, I actually don't know who's going to be there in person. Most of the people you see here actually live locally, so we force ourselves to use the device to understand how it works. If you don't force yourself to use it, it's too easy to circumvent when you want to, and then you don't understand the true experience of being a remote person. So when I go into the office in the morning, I don't know who's going to be there and who's going to be in a beam, but it doesn't make any difference. And that is the real goal, is that it can be the same whether you're there in person or whether you're there in a remote presence device. Now, I want to just quickly mention, Hollywood always has these uncanny predictions for new technology. I'd say what we're trying to do is build version 0.001 of what you see in Avatar. There have been some other movies that have had takes on remote presence that I think are interesting too, but Avatar is like, if you go way out into the future, that is really remote presence. We're a long way from that. And then there's this Hollywood interpretation I feel obligated to bring up, because anytime there's a story about beam or any kind of remote presence device, the #1 comment on the internet is something along the lines of, they stole this from Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory, which is a CBS sitcom. The truth is, not only did they not steal from us, or we steal from them, they used TechSci to film the show. And it was really fun. And the thing that surprised me the most about it is that they didn't even want to fake the system. They just used a live running TechSci. So 95% was good enough to film a TV show. But to use it every day in your life, it has to be even more reliable. So this is kind of what I was getting to before. So the difference between these systems really is engineering. Functionally, there's not that much difference. You've got video, you've got a head that you can see, it's real time, the audio is pretty good. But the difference here is that this is designed to be reliable, consistent, and cheaper to produce. And but I think this is a really, really important difference for HCI and HRI research, because it takes this technology from being something that you can test in a lab, in a controlled setting with a small number of people, to something you can test with almost anyone in the world that has an internet connection. And that's the kind of research that we're doing now, and we're getting some results that I think are really interesting, so I'm going to share that. So we've done, as I mentioned, we've also set up company policies to force ourselves to use this technology, to try to get a better idea internally what it's like to be a remote person who has to rely on this every day. With our customers, we've done basic field work, mostly interviews. We've studied a total of 24 users across 3 continents, highlighted on the map, with a combination of 30 to 60-minute interviews and other informal observations. Some of the users are us, some are from our early customers, some use the device a few times a week, some use it all day long, every day. So to try to make the results of this a little more concise, we've come up with what we believe are 6 core principles of what it takes to have remote presence. And initially our rule of thumb was we want to be able to do what a human could do. We want to reproduce that as reliably as possible. But as I said earlier, we've learned through this research, and maybe we would have learned if we surveyed the literature a little bit more up front, that actually we do need to go beyond being there in some important ways. And I'll go through each of these in turn. Okay, so humans can move freely in all directions. You can keep up with other people as they're walking. You're not going to be stymied by a pencil on the floor or even furniture that's in your way. You can push it out of your way. So if you're going to have remote presence, it's important to be able to do the same thing. This is just a quick demonstration of some of the physical capabilities of a beam. You can push chairs, you can go over wires, you can push doors open and closed. On the lighter side of things, we recently converted one of our offices into a makeshift soccer field using beam. We call it beam ball. It's pretty fun. But in general, wherever people can go, beam can go. And also, you'll probably notice I use the term beam interchangeably with remote presence device. I apologize. I've been wrapped up in this world for so long. A lot of times what I mean to say is this applies to remote presence devices, but that's been my focus for so long. It's hard for me to sometimes separate the two. But another part of being able to move freely is having a UI that makes it intuitive to do so. I mean, if you're struggling with the device, then it's not going to feel like you have the kind of freedom to move that you want. So we went through several iterations on this. Ultimately settled on this layout because it allows us to stack the video, so you've got the vertical continuity between the two cameras, but also makes the video as large as possible, so you get the highest resolution of what you could see and have the controls to move the device around. And we're still working on it, of course, but this is the best we've done so far. Having to ask people for help is really an impediment to feeling remotely present. It makes you dependent on them. So for example, it's very important that you can dock yourself. This is something that we learned with TechSci in the early days of Beam. For example, Dallas, anytime he was done using the device, he had to ask someone to go plug him in. And that got to be very frustrating. And at least one of those things that, like, in terms of being able to use it over time without losing effectiveness, that kind of thing, that frustration builds up and you just say, I'm tired of it and I don't want to use it anymore. So we have to solve all of those problems. And some of the other remote presence you might have seen also have this problem. Another, sort of on the other side, you also don't want anyone to have to help you to get into the device. You can just log in and go. And this is what we mean by having self-sufficiency. You don't have to have anyone accept the call for you, set up the system, add you to an address list, anything like that. Because we found that really one of the most important things about having effective remote presence is no one else needs to learn any new behavior to interact with you. They can just talk to you like, yeah. Oh, sorry, Terry, I thought you had a question. Actually, that's interesting. So your ability to do this, I'll come back to that later, because that's the kind of thing that our users are asking for. Nonverbal communication, things, be able to do things without having to create attention. So the idea is that you can interact with somebody using the device the same way that you would interact with a human. And then one last example I wanted to give of self-sufficiency. So pilots often mute their microphones for a variety of reasons. Maybe you've got kids screaming in the background. And that's good, but they often forget to unmute before they start speaking again, and that's very frustrating because you have to rewind the first 5 seconds of every conversation when this happens. And so we tried, and it's also a mistake you would never make in person. So again, these are the things that add up. So we tried a bunch of things, but found that one small change really made a big difference. And unfortunately, I don't have a video of it here. But what happens, what the system does is, if it detects you're speaking while it's muted, it will pulse that mute message with your input audio level. So basically, if you start talking and you're muted, this thing will start to flicker red, give you an indication that, hey, you're talking, but no one's hearing you. And that has almost entirely resolved this problem. Now people stop complaining about this so much, and we're really excited that made such a big difference. I mean, you don't want to walk around feeling like you're looking through a tube, right? So if that's what it feels like to use remote presence, again, it will be frustrating. Peripheral awareness is very important, but so is the ability to zoom in on things. And so, that's why we chose these wide-angle lenses to be able to give you the peripheral awareness, but also coupled that with the ability to zoom in on details. So we have a digital zoom that you can use because we want to give you a field of view that is pretty close to human. And kind of this, the same thing goes with audio. You want to be able to hear what's going on around you, not just when someone's speaking directly in front of you. So, as I mentioned earlier, we built a microphone array into the top, and it has some custom software to do background noise reduction and echo cancellation. And this is one of the things where we were able to, I believe, really get into beyond being there. This is one area where it can truly be better than being there in person, and I'll give you an example. We have a server closet, like many companies, full of very noisy computers, fans, et cetera. They make a lot of noise. If you go in there, it's almost deafening. And so if you go in there with another person, you have to scream to each other to be heard. But if you go in there in a Beam, it's able to effectively remove almost all of that noise. So what happens is and I've seen this happen, otherwise I would have never guessed. 2 people are in the server room with somebody in a Beam. They're screaming to each other to be heard. But the Beam pilot, all he hears is screaming people. because it's removed all the background noise. And so in order to hear each other, they have to scream, but to him, it's totally unnecessary. So, this is one where if I had a choice, I would prefer to go into that server room in a beam than go in physically. Yeah.
So one thing I think Layla has mentioned in the past, and in those kinds of scenarios, is actually you have a lack of almost what you might call proprioception. And in this case, the way it represents itself is that I start speaking and my volume is quite loud, and
Yes.
I'm not aware of this.
Yes.
Do you run into these kinds of awareness issues as well?
It's one of our biggest problems. And I will come back to that later, but so all you have is a visual indication of how loud you are, and of course that changes depending on the room you're in too. Like if it's a quiet room and then you go to a loud room, how do you know how much you're supposed to change that, or how much do you know how do you know how much to raise your mic gain? That's a really big problem for us, and you really see it exacerbated in situations where there are multiple remote presence devices, because if there's one person being a little too loud in a beam, people will compensate and just speak a little bit louder back to that person, back to the pilot. But if you have a lot of people in a room all doing that, and then the beams are sort of trying to one-up each other, it can become very loud quite quickly. It's kind of like the cocktail party effect, but for people who maybe don't have a good sense of how loud they are, so it's even worse. Sorry, not the cocktail party effect. I forget what this is called, but there's a property of conversation where people will continually speak a little bit louder than other people in a room where a lot of people are speaking so that they can be heard. And people will it's sort of like there's like a game theory thing that happens where people will get louder and louder and louder to the point where it becomes painful, and that's where it stops. So that's why anytime you go into a room like a cocktail party where a lot of people are speaking, it's at this level that's borderline painful on your ears. And so if everyone could just voluntarily bring that down, it would solve the problem. But anyway, we see the same thing with Beam. And one other thing I wanted to mention about audio is that audio for the locals is also very good. I don't know if you will believe me, but this really does happen. There are times in our office when you will go looking for somebody because you heard them speaking and find out that they're not actually there. They're just there in a beam. You're tricked because you thought, it just sounded like they were there, right? You say, hey, so-and-so, can you come help me with this? And you say, wait a second, I thought you were here. Well, I am here, of course, but I'm in a beam. And if it weren't that good, then you definitely wouldn't have scenes like this. Because if we couldn't faithfully reproduce the audio, it just wouldn't be good enough to go analog to digital twice like this. And sure, these folks could switch to a multi-way video call or Google Hangout or something, but this was an impromptu discussion that would have never happened if they weren't all logged into a beam already, and that's kind of the important distinction here.
You watch on TV, the anchor says, "Hi, Josh, off in Syria. What is happening today in the battle?" And then you stand there looking stupid for a few seconds, and then you answer. Of course, you aren't really feeling. It's not like you're thinking. You haven't heard yet because of lag. Do you get that phenomenon with lag with these?
Well, we've done everything we can to minimize the latency in our system, but network latency is something that we have very little control over. So we, generally speaking, anywhere in North America or to Europe, which is the bulk of where we've tried these things so far, it's been good enough to have a conversation. I mean, there's research on how much latency you can tolerate to have a conversation. 400 milliseconds is like the upper bound of where it becomes really just untenable. And so we've done everything we can to minimize latency in our hardware and our software, but when you add that to the network latency, so India, for example, is kind of pushing the limits of what we can do. From North America to India, the network latency is just high enough that we can't be certain about. So we try to control the situations where people are using the device. And if you're going over a satellite link, for example, it just wouldn't be. I mean, you could have a conversation because you can learn how to adjust that, but controlling a 100-pound remote presence device, in an environment with other people, that's not something that we're comfortable doing. So we actually have safety limitations on that detect the round-trip latency and won't let you drive if it rises above a certain level.
I routinely interact with someone who's coming in from Argentina, and the sound is perfectly fine. I mean, we have normal conversations. The only thing you sometimes see is a little ghosting when she makes fast movements. But in Argentina is a ways away. So.
And that probably has more to do with the quality of the connection than the actual latency. Although those things can be related. Loss can cause latency and vice versa. Yes.
Sorry, I actually work in Cisco telepresence, so I know a little bit about latency here. So we actually do have conversations anywhere in the world in under 200 milliseconds.
200, well, that's that one-way or round trip?
That's from one end to the other.
Okay, so yeah, when I said 400, I was talking about round trip.
But you have to pay for it. So it isn't just over the Comcast network.
Right.
Pay who? Cisco?
Right, so, in terms of speed of light from here to India, I think it's, it's much more, it's more like on the order of 30 to 50 milliseconds or something. I can't remember. I mean, you could do the math pretty quickly.
I don't remember. Basically, if you pay enough money and say fiber only,
Right.
No satellite links or anything, you can get it.
So I agree. It's theoretically possible anywhere on Earth to have a low enough latency connection if you have the. But most people who are trying these devices out want to just use them over the internet and sort of so they don't have access to that kind of thing. But okay, the next remote presence principle I wanted to talk about was the size of the device. So we experimented a lot with the height. We settled on a height of 5 feet 2 inches. Because it's comfortable for both standing and sitting interaction. And people always ask, oh, have you thought about making the head go up and down? Yes, we thought about it. It adds a lot of cost and complexity to manufacturing. And we found that this height actually works pretty well for both. And Leila Takayama, I think, was mentioned earlier here, who's a researcher at Willow Garage, has collaborated on a number of remote presence questions. But specifically, she did a study with some researchers from the University of Wisconsin on the height of remote presence devices and found that indeed it does have an impact on things like leadership, authority, and persuasiveness in interaction. So it's really important to get the height right, and we believe we've done that, but I guess the bigger point is it does matter.
So it's a really interesting question. Some of the Olson's research showed that if it was looking down on you, you basically were more submissive, but if you were looking up at it, or if it was looking up at you, then it felt odd, especially given that the person on the other side of the screen may not be aware of where they are and what those cues might be leading to. And this 5'2" is a really interesting height because it means that you're always one or the other, right? If I'm sitting, I'm definitely looking up, and if I'm standing, I'm almost very certainly looking down, unless I'm a very short individual.
That's a good point. I don't know if we've studied the difference between sitting and standing interactions with respect to height. That is a really interesting question. Yes?
The height could have also been controlled, right? Like up and down?
Sorry?
The height could have also have been controlled, right?
You mean to be able to adjust the height?
Yeah.
Yeah. But as I was saying, that we decided against that for cost and complexity reasons.
So you're suggesting when you get angry, you just sort of...
But that's an interesting social question. How tall should you be? Should you be allowed to be whatever height you want? Because what you're saying, oh, I'm going to go into a negotiation, I'm going to raise it up. Should you be allowed to do that? I don't really know. That's a good question.
There's your beyond being there.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe you have to pay for it. Actually, we were at South by Southwest. I don't know if anyone, well, you probably don't follow this closely, but Shaquille O'Neal became very interested. He wanted to actually put some money into our company. And we were kind of debating what kind of beam do we need to build him, because 5'2" is probably not what he has in mind. But,
You also have some control of the size of your face by just how close you get to the camera.
correct, and that was one other thing I was going to mention. The size of the display, we went with 17 inches because we felt like that was the smallest that we could get away with and still show a head at relatively lifelike size, depending again on how you positioned it. And we did experiments on this. I don't think it's ever been published, but Layla and some other people did research also on the size of the head of the remote presence device and found that if you get larger than lifelike, it becomes creepy very quickly. So you could physically build one with an even bigger screen that makes your head even bigger, and as soon as it's bigger than lifelike size, then I would recommend against it. From our experience. Yes?
So you touched on this a little bit before, and you just mentioned it again now. So like my initial thought for like the issue of nonverbals is why not have like a full rectangle screen that shows the full line, right? And like so much of the nonverbals that like what this person's doing with their hands, or like so much nonchalant like conversation that about like, oh, nice shoes today or something like that. Like that's being lost, and you can't like. I'm fishing with my hands, I'm not paying attention. Or
That's an interesting question. Where would you put the camera though to get that?
You probably maybe need 2, 3 smaller cameras and
right, because like normally people are using it at a desk, like a desk like this with a chair and a computer in front. And so there's really no way to see all of you. So you'd have to sort of build a custom station that you would stand in front of it maybe. I don't know. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question.
I mean, if this person's actually walking around the office, then yeah, they should be probably standing up anyway. You know, or like,
well, they're walking or they're sitting or, you know, they could be doing a lot of things.
yeah, I guess, I don't know, but it's just, my first reaction was like, I would probably make it full screen because I want to know, like, you know. What
But then you lose a lot of the detail of the face. So to get facial, you know, there's a lot of information conveyed by, you know, facial reactions and things too. So I was just going to say that the mechanical design of our device, and the product design of it, was really dictated, a lot of it by the fact that we wanted to have this large display, high off the ground, but still be dynamically and statically stable. So if you think about, okay, why does the device look the way it does? A lot of it is just to be able to put that screen up there and make the thing still safe and stable to be around. So we talked about this a little bit already, and I made the point that, you know, even if it worked 95% of the time, like for example, if your car worked 95% of the time, you might stop using it to get to work. You know, you just can't afford the risk that 1 out of every 20 times you're not going to be able to go to work today because your car stopped working. And so that's where we're trying. You know, that's why we're trying to get with this. You know, 95% is good for prototypes. It's good for experimentation, but it's not good enough to build a product that people are going to make part of their normal work practice. You know, along the lines of a plain old telephone or say a Toyota Camry. That's what we're really going for here with this product. You know it will work whenever you need it. Okay, so just to recap, these were our remote presence principles. You know, you can move freely. You're self-sufficient. You have good audio and visual awareness. You're roughly the human size, or at least when it's appropriate, and you can count on it. You can count on the device when you need it. So let's see. Okay, so we learned some interesting stuff. In addition to the sort of overall principles of what it means to have remote presence, we've learned some surprising things. Some have been good, some have been surprising, and I'll get to both of them. We did indeed find that people felt like they had more presence. Here are some quotes from actual Beam pilots. I really call attention to the last two, especially this last one. This is a guy who was separated by his colleagues, from his colleagues by an ocean and 9 time zones. And when is the last time that you saw someone high-five a video conferencing display? I thought that was really cool, and it kind of shows how it's making him more human to his coworkers. And sort of continuing on the idea of being more human, we see that people are able to interact in more sophisticated ways. With this last quote, you can see that sometimes it's the absence of something that shows you its value. This was somebody who'd come to rely on Beam and then lost it for a day because of a networking issue. I think he was moving or something like that, and so he said without it, he just felt blind. He just felt like he didn't have the kind of awareness that he was used to. And another thing that we see is that experienced pilots learn how to make more natural movements, taking advantage of the mobility that the device gets them. So you'll see in this example, the pilot's following the conversation, which gives you a much better idea of where his intent or where his attention is. You can move forward to signal the increased attention, or you can move back for the opposite. And even if you're not following a conversation, the most experienced pilots will still kind of move themselves around a little bit just to show that they're alive. And it's really interesting. And it really adds to the feeling that they're there. We saw concrete examples of how communication improved. People are able to do things like pair programming. We didn't necessarily expect that they would work for that. This is something that I would love to say we've empirically also can prove, but we really can't. This is more anecdotal, but in our years of using remote presence, even going back before Beam, we found that it takes about 20 minutes for a local to forget that they're talking to a person through a device, and then they just think they're talking to a person. And we know this from the times that something happens to break the spell, like a technical glitch or some kind of other interruption, or the guy has, the pilot has to leave, and then you're sort of startled back into reality. Wait a second, I thought this person I was talking to is here. They're not really. Well, they're kind of here. I don't know. So that's really cool. So it gives us also a good idea of how long a demo we need to do if we're trying to sell one of these. And we'd love to get this number down to 0, of course. But knowing what the number is now actually is pretty valuable. Okay, so can you have too much presence? Being in a remote presence device makes you very conspicuous. Some people like this, some people don't. Kind of depends on your personality. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this evolves as the devices themselves become more common and more ubiquitous. It's less of a curiosity, and is there something about the device that still makes it kind of stand out?
That's an interesting quote to me, because it's actually far less conspicuous than full screen with someone over Skype, where they're
on a screen like
God mode, right? their knitting is basically everyone's focal point, even if you're giving,
I see.
even if you're speaking. Here it's at least constrained to a screen.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. I mean, so in this particular example, there was a person who was knitting who meant to be just sort of participating in the back of a meeting, not really, getting any attention. And so, but people, just because of being in the beam, that person got a lot of attention and clearly didn't intend for it. But I see your, yeah, I mean, I would say that's another limitation of using this for remote presence. It's like making them even less human. Right. A lot of these questions are kind of along the lines of not only because it's new, but also because we're able, at Suitable, we have a much higher proportion of, we have a higher saturation of remote presence devices than probably almost anywhere else in the world. And so we're seeing things that maybe are the tip of the iceberg or maybe are just really unique to the kind of environment that we have. Yes?
When you have the interface up on your computer, can you also be multitasking and doing other things?
You can, yes.
Okay. Is that, I imagine that is not quite the same thing as knitting, but might have some similar characteristics?
I mean, it depends on,
You have to split it.
to me, it's one of the things that does make it better than being there too, because it would be difficult in many meetings to be doing something simultaneously that wouldn't be considered either rude or distracting, depending on what else you're trying to do. I mean, maybe you're just checking your email on the laptop, it's okay, but so it gives you the ability to really be doing two things at once if you want to. Again, it kind of depends on the culture of the place that you're in and the people that you work with. Can kind of go both ways. So at Suitable, we do a lot of passive beaming. We just kind of sit and log in and sit at our desks. And that creates all that informal awareness and impromptu stuff that we think is so great. Most of our early customers have not adopted that same behavior, and it could just simply be because they don't have the same number of devices that we have, or maybe there's something about it that just doesn't quite click for them. This is something we really need to understand. We were expecting more of that because we think it's really valuable, so we need to understand why more people aren't adopting the same behavior. This is something that's unique because, as I said, no one else has so many devices, at least per person. But our company of 20 people regularly has 7 or 8 people in a beam at one time. I've seen as many as 10. And so I'm showing this picture because it gives you an idea of what it's like to be the only human in a meeting full of remote presence devices. And he's smiling, but some people, again, it depends on your personality. Some people can be uncomfortable by this. The things that make it not quite human, they start to add up. I think there's some kind of additive effect that's happening here. So, like for example, the fact that you can't tell who a pilot is from all sides. You can see if you're looking at the front at the screen, but from the side or if you get a funny angle, then you can't tell any. So all those things, those little things, when there's a lot of them, I think it starts to add up and makes it, yes?
So is that pilot-to-pilot interaction a little less than being there, would you say?
In what sense?
If I'm looking at another pilot, and there's some
Oh, I see.
loss, I guess, from looking at them and is that a challenging scenario?
It's not, yeah, I mean, it's not as good as seeing them with your eyes in person, but it's good enough that it works. I mean, we do this. It doesn't stop us from doing this.
Usually the guy who's there second from the left can't actually see the person who's the leftmost, the beam leftmost. Because his camera angle
maybe
is hitting it. He'd have to turn.
Yeah, and then so you sort of have, but you turn, you're probably turning a lot during the meeting, and then you remember where people are.
You have to turn to face him.
Right.
Otherwise he sees the side. Right.
So you kind of establish who's where at the start of the meeting, I think. People look around and see what's going on, and then he probably remembers who's to his left, but you can't tell by looking at all times who's there. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And I also think there's this thing happening where the more devices that are there at the same time, the more you start to see them as devices again instead of people. And again, this is something we need to improve. And looking from the other side, this is a similar picture. This is what it's like to be the only human. And the reason I wanted to show this one is you can see how they're kind of all circled around. And I don't know why this is happening. Again, this is stuff that we need to understand. But when you're the only human with a lot of beams or remote presence devices, they all end up looking at you. Somehow there's you're a human anchor for this interaction. And if they start talking to each other, they'll turn, but then they always kind of come back to looking at the person who's in the room or the people. And of course, then at some point it can start to feel like, why am I here? What do I need to be here for? Did I just turn the lights on? That kind of stuff. These are good problems to have, by the way. If the problems we have that are too many devices out in the world, then we're excited about that. But And this is something we talked about already. It's a little harder to know how loud you are, so it can get loud. I think this is really interesting. So there's this tension between being able to go beyond being there, but also giving people superhuman powers that are going to make the locals uncomfortable. Such as hearing things that you didn't think they could hear. Like if I had, super hearing, and I could hear a conversation all the way down that hallway, and somebody said something about me, and I ran out there and said, "Hey, what are you talking about?" That would make people uncomfortable. They say, "Wait a second, I didn't know that," and then now they're not going to trust it about it. That could really undermine people embracing this technology and creating the kind of trust for human interaction that we're really going for here. Same thing with vision. If you had like a 100x camera on this thing, you might have the same kind of. So we need to be really careful about that. Now I've mentioned a couple of ways where we do think it's better than being there, and we're trying to do that in ways that don't also make people uncomfortable. Like one other thing that I wanted to mention is kind of funny is that you can race people, right? So we have a really long building, kind of long and thin. We have beams at each end. So if I have a meeting at one end of the building, and then I need to talk to some people at the other end, and they're going to walk over there, I can be there instantly. And then I say, "Hey, what took you guys so long?" And that kind of stuff that's definitely a benefit because you can move around. I mean, you can actually go around the world. Like in the video, you can instantly teleport, anywhere you need to be. But that's one where I don't see that there's much risk of making people uncomfortable by the fact that you can do it. But we need to pay attention. Let's see. Okay, so as you could probably tell. Oh, sorry. Yes, question.
I was curious, when you're just sort of hanging out to sort of be there, but you're working, say, coding or whatever, do people adopt any sort of practice on how they signal that to locals? Because they don't have a desk that they sit down at, so obviously I'm at my desk working, they're at their desk working no matter where they are piloting the device. Do they?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that also we need to understand more to translate to what customers are doing, because at Suitable we do have desks. So basically everyone who's there or in a beam has a desk, has desk space. And so what you do is, if you're not actively doing anything, if you're just sort of working passively, as we call it, what we tend to do is we just drive over to where our desk is, turn face out so people can see we're there. And then that way you can come over and talk to somebody. It doesn't matter if they're there physically, in person, or if they're there in a beam, you know where you can go find them to talk to them. And that works really well for us. But as I was saying, we're not seeing as many of our customers do that, and maybe it's because one of the reasons might be that the people who are going to be using the technology don't have an equivalent space where they can just hang out. And I don't know what we do about that. Maybe they need to invest in the space, or maybe we need to find some other way to signal that you want to communicate with those people.
Because that wasn't obvious.
Right, so yeah, so we went from the scenario where we were local and we wanted to sort of learn what it's like to act remotely, act like we're remote. But if you're coming from the, so this is exactly the kind of stuff that we need to figure out. Yes.
One of the advantages of this is you save office space.
Right.
You have to give us space anyway.
Right, so you don't necessarily need a full office. All you need is like a 2x2 square. But then if you're putting somebody in a 2x2 square, are they going to feel weird about that? Right, it's kind of, you wouldn't want.
All lined up in the chargers.
You could, but I don't know if people feel comfortable being seen that way either. Just being one in a line of. These are good questions. Yeah, so I thought I was going to wrap things up with some of the interesting areas for research when we've already talked a lot about a lot of interesting questions, but some areas of research that we're currently exploring, and some others, where other people wanted to get involved. These are some of the interesting questions that we see. So pilots want to have more presence. They want to do things like carry things around, do the nonverbal communication. One pilot mentioned wanting to be able to, which what I thought Terry was doing incorrectly, get attention without speaking, be able to raise a hand, or do things like nodding, passive agreement, that kind of stuff. So how can we do that, keeping in mind the cost of adding, more degrees of freedom to the device? Now, what if we're really successful as an industry and there are lots of remote presence devices all around the world? And what if they start to outnumber locals? And we've talked about some of the challenges of that. We need to figure out how to improve this for locals, because right now there are some drawbacks that we really need to figure out how to make it something that people are more comfortable with. And we also talked about how it can get loud, for example. But a bigger question is, what is the workplace of the future look like when this is a common option? Like when this is an option for many, if not most people. How does it change the way we design offices? How does it change the way we design the home, interior design, architecture, community spaces? If you can visit a museum with a remote presence device, how would you redesign a museum? I think these are all really interesting questions, and maybe it's a little early to be redesigning museums all over the world for this, but the technology is coming, and it probably at least merits some thought. There's an interesting question of when is the appropriate time to transition to another medium. So we see that this happens all the time in our office, and sometimes it'll just turn into a Skype call to say, hey, let's just take this offline, it's okay. Well, offline meaning not in a beam. But then others can't overhear. So there's actually a lot of benefit for having this conversation out in the open. We have an open floor plan, like many offices, so other people can chime in or contribute if they're interested. But we still use all the other sort of we use IM, chat, email, and everything too. When's the right time? How seamless do you want to make that? I think that's a really interesting question. Here's a meeting I recently attended. Sorry for the quality of the photo, but I'll explain that in a second. So all four of us were remote, as you can see, but we decided to stay that way because we were expecting a fifth person to come in person. But when he rolled in a beam as well, then we said, hey, forget it. We'll just switch to a Hangout. But the other thing I was going to point out is the reason that the picture, the quality is so bad is it's washed out because the lights are off. And that's because there are no humans there. So you have all these funny situations that can arise because we're taking advantage of the fact that we have this technology, but there are some very basic things that we're still not able to handle. And I also wanted to mention some of the opportunities with crowd work, which has developed along with the internet as a way of quickly assembling a large number of people to work on something. And Professor Bernstein's research, for example, shows that one way to really improve crowd work is through better communication. I think it's interesting to think about what happens if you combine remote presence with something like Mechanical Turk. Right? So now the tasks can be done not just by somebody with a computer and the internet, but what if you give them a physical presence as well? What kind of tasks? How do you manage that? I mean, I can only the possibilities really seem almost limitless. And if you look at some of the new services that are popping up, like TaskRabbit and Exec, as ways of applying crowd work to in-person tasks, such as delivery or cleaning, seem to be a couple of the most successful so far. Remote presence can actually extend that capability quite a bit by allowing you to do these kind of in-person tasks almost anywhere and by anyone.
This is actually non-trivial in some interesting ways. Jeff Bigham, one of his pieces of research, had people driving around robots, Roomba in this case, and what they found was they were taking votes, and say there's a tree straight ahead in front of you. Half the people say go right, half say go left. You average and you just drive straight into it. So you have
in real time.
Oh yeah, in real time.
Cool.
This is, what they end up doing is electing a leader to sort of temporarily sort of round robin around, but it's not clear. If you had some people controlling my arms and other people controlling where I'm moving, could you actually make it feel like a single individual?
That is interesting.
I want to see the first remote presence flash mob.
Yeah, for example, I mean,
DDoS. You see this bunch of these things rolling into a space and starting to sing or something.
I mean, we can contrive these things, but you really want to see when it happened organically
Yeah, right.
for a reason. That will be really exciting. So there are a lot of and then finally, I find this is a really interesting question to me. Where will people live and work again when this becomes a more common option? So, for example, will Bay Area real estate suffer? People pay a real premium to live in San Francisco or Silicon Valley. So what if you're able to really effectively decouple where you live from where you work? I don't know. That's a big question. But one thing I do know is these are two places that a suitable employee has lived since we built Beam. We had a guy who was living in San Francisco. He said, you know what? I'm tired of paying this rent. I don't have to live here anymore. I'm moving to Maui. And it didn't change his job at all. He works with us the exact same way he did before. And then winter came around. And he said, you know what? Actually, I want to go to Lake Tahoe. And he can do that. Now, it gets a little more complicated when you have family and stuff. But, I'm kind of envious of these young guys. They can live wherever they want now. And so when this becomes an option for a lot of people, what does that do to where people choose to live in the societies that are there? I mean, I don't know. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any more questions or. I guess we have a few minutes. Andreas.
Yeah. First of all, when you showed the two pictures, I thought people had themes in those places, so that they, yeah, so that I could sort of hang out on the beach with that thing. But what you said that when there were this human didn't show up, the one that you had expected, right, when you were there, and you decided to switch to Hangout. So why did you do that? Why was it better then?
Because when there are no humans there, then most of the benefit of having the device just for the purposes of that meeting. So it's interesting. What we do is we all switch to a Google Hangout for the meeting, and then we all switch back to the remote presence devices afterward and drive out again. Because only for the limited duration of that meeting, there's not much of a benefit because all we're doing is looking at each other and talking. And sorry, yeah. Well, no, and there are definitely some improvements by switching to a Hangout. So you probably have the video and the audio are going to be better because it's not going, like I said, it's not going analog to digital twice. You're just going straight from the camera. And some of the nice, features of being able to communicate non-verbally or informally, or the more rich interaction that you have with people who are there. And the convenience of also having it for them. So notice also, if you're a person who's there and the other people in the meeting are in remote presence devices, you didn't have to do anything to set up that meeting. You didn't have to answer a Skype call, turn on a computer, turn on the projector, anything like that. You just sat there and they rolled in. So that's very convenient for you. But if everyone's remote, then it's not saving that work for anybody. And so the benefits of just using a Google Hangout kind of outweigh the benefits of staying in the devices. Yes?
No, as you remind me, you have sort of a hub and spoke model. What if I have offices in 5 cities?
Right.
So we have a meeting with one person from each of these 5 cities. Who rolls where?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we're exploring that with some of our customers now. I mean, the honest answer is we don't know. That's not a one that we were able to simulate with ourselves easily. We're only in 1 or 2 locations ourselves. I would anticipate that in most cases there will still be a de facto hub where most people are. I mean, if it's truly one from 5 different places, then again, remote presence might not be the right thing because almost everyone's going to be remote from somewhere. But my guess is in most situations there will still be some reason that one of the locations would be a hub, either because of other factors like other equipment that's in the room or other things that they have access to, or just simply having more people. It's a good question. Yes?
Does it support screen sharing?
Yes. You can share, an application or your desktop and show it on the device. That's not in our video because it was added since we built that. Yes.
I wonder how you might change the design if you were considering non-office scenarios, right? Like bring grandma along to Disneyland,
Right.
Or did I leave the stove on at home when I left for work? Do you think that the design?
Well, those are very different too.
Well,
The solution probably would not be the same.
I guess that's the open question. Sort of, if you were to switch those bits, what do you think would be the first things you think about changing?
We get asked about this stuff all the time. I mean, people see the demo and they think, can we use it for this totally different thing that I have in mind? So one thing is that it's really designed to be used indoors. We designed it to navigate any kind of ADA compliant space, so ramps, floors, bumps, etc. That should be okay. But once you take it outside and you've got things like curbs and animals and dirt and all, it's not. So any kind of outdoor application would probably require us to redesign, the mechanical system a fair amount. For use in things like, one of the most common things that people say is, I would love to put this in my parents' house. Almost everyone that's ever seen this thing, whether they want to buy it for their company or not, they say, I would like to put this in my mom, my dad, my parents' house. So I can, talk to them more easily, I can check on them, do the kind of thing, make sure that they're safe, that nothing happened. But unfortunately, at our current price point, most people don't consider that an option. So we certainly see an opportunity there. I don't know what the changes are to make that. I mean, mostly it sounds like cost reduction. So what can we do to preserve the quality of that experience, but bring the price down quite a bit? I don't know. If we thought we could, we would have done it already. I mean, to make it as reliable and high quality and really give you that true remote presence, we did what we thought was the absolute minimum, actually. So I guess that doesn't really answer your question, but I think each one of those scenarios would be different and probably have different needs that need to be And then there's also the networking. So one of the first things that we have to do anytime we deploy these into a new site is we have to make sure that your Wi-Fi is really good, or 4G. We now have support for 4G coverage. But in many cases, people think that their Wi-Fi is really good, but there are little gaps here and there, and that's really important for us to find out about. So, again, to put it in the home requires a level of service and attention that we have to think about. Yes.
What's the difference between 95% and almost 100% in terms of how the device failed when you guys were doing something?
Oh, like where did that 5% come from?
Yeah.
It
It was a hardware problem or a network problem?
was a variety of things. Unfortunately, I wish it were just one thing that we could have fixed. That would have been a lot easier. There's probably about 10 things that each contributed 0.5% or something like that. So at that time we were using off-the-shelf video conferencing. We were using basically we were using Skype, but a Linux build, because we have a Linux computer on the device, and that one's not as reliable, and occasionally it just would fail to connect a call. That was really frustrating because we didn't know what to do about that. So we had to we developed our own video conferencing application from the ground up just to solve that problem and a couple of others like it. But that got us over the hump on that one. Wi-Fi reliability. So I mentioned we have 2 dual-band Wi-Fi radios, because one, just isn't. We have a actually quite sophisticated handoff algorithm. So one's always active and one's scanning for another network to connect to, so that we're able to prevent any gaps when you're switching from one access point to another, or if one goes down. That took a lot of engineering. Just a variety of things like that. Mechanical failures. Going through, making sure we had to evaluate a lot of different components for, the motors, cameras, and everything, to make sure that we got ones that were really going to be reliable, and put all the component verification procedures in place. We didn't go through all of these steps when we built the TechSci prototypes. Yes?
Are a lot of the systems on the robot redundant then? Or just like the Wi-Fi?
Oh, I see.
Just curious. Because I know like the segues, that was one of the big things, was like almost
Yeah.
everything on there is duplicated.
I don't know if I would say if everything is redundant, but we certainly have a lot of things like safety watchdogs and other safety loops that are constantly checking things. So there are a lot of redundant checks even within the firmware and the software.
Sure.
Mechanically, I wouldn't say that everything is redundant, but that's harder for me to say. My role is I lead the software team. So yes.
Have you looked into any augmentation with autonomy as far as go into the room, go into the corner?
We have looked into it. It's a common question. As it currently exists, Beam has no autonomy. Some of the other remote presence devices, by the way, do. They'll do things like automatically dock themselves, or I forget what else they can do. Simple stuff, but a little bit. And we decided that it was more important for us to focus on doing a faithful, what's the word I'm looking for, to actually carry out the intentions of the pilot as faithfully as possible, and not so worried as much about. We're also concerned about safety. So once you get into this autonomous behavior, it's kind of that same 95%. If it operates safely 95% of the time, that is not anywhere near good enough. So you have to make sure if you're going to add any kind of those features that you can guarantee that it's never going to go over a staircase, or it's never going to. And so we felt like it was more important to make sure that everything the pilot is doing is exactly what the device is going to do. But we're certainly thinking about it for the future. It's hard for me to say exactly, what the product will be doing in a year or two from now. But we've thought about a lot of things.